Hi, everybody in our audience. We're just going to give it one more minute for all of the folks who are in the waiting room to continue to join in, and then I will kick things off and we'll start this virtual workshop. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this 2-hour virtual workshop titled Prosperity versus Survival, the Power of Partnerships, Affiliations, and Alliances. Today's virtual workshop is brought to you by both the Association of Governing Boards Consulting Practice and the New England Board of Higher Education. Before I allow my panelists for this first segment to introduce themselves, let me go over a few webinar logistics and some information on today's structure and how you can interact with us. The first important point is that this webinar and this workshop is recorded, and the recording and the slides that we use today will be made available to you after the webinar concludes. Those are typically sent out the same day or the day after, and those will be coming to you from AGB. So be on the lookout for those. Today's workshop is 2 hours long and has 2 segments. In the first hour, we're going to have a discussion between the president of the New England Board of Higher Education, Michael Thomas, and Rick Beyer from AGB Consulting. That conversation will focus on topics around mergers, affiliations, and alliances in higher education. Following the conclusion of that discussion, we'll have a small bridge session where the president of the New England Commission on Higher Education, Larry Shaw, will join us and give his perspective on what he heard in the first hour, as well as his insights and perspectives from an accreditation standpoint. And then we'll transition into our second hour, which will be a panel discussion between multiple panelists, including Michelle Perkins, the president of New England College, David Rowe, the interim president of Lancaster Theological Seminary and an AGB Consulting senior consultant, as well as Larry Shaw and Rick Beyer. That conversation in hour 2 will be moderated by Candace Williams from the New England Board of Higher Education. Throughout today's session, we'll have opportunities for you to send in questions, and we'll try our best to answer those questions as we move through the 2-hour session today. So please interact with us. We encourage you to send in your questions or your comments or your experiences or perspectives using the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see on that control panel that there's a small tab that says questions, and you'll be able to interact with myself and my colleagues who will be monitoring those questions. We will then funnel those back to the speakers so that they can address them as best as they can. With that logistic information, housekeeping out of the way, I would like to turn things over now to my panelists in the first hour, Dr. Michael Thomas and Mr. Rick Beyer, who you should see are live on their webcams. And I'm going to allow Michael to introduce himself, and then we'll continue on with Rick's introduction and move on from there. So Michael, it's all yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks, Rick, and to the AGB team. I want to say thanks and welcome to everyone who's joining us today and for the opportunity that we have for this conversation. Just a couple of quick words of sort of background. I covered this from having been in the presidency of New England Board of Higher Education for over a decade now, and prior to that, sort of a combination of work in higher education, public policy, and business, which includes involvement as a trustee and as a faculty member and as a university administrator. And as many of you know, NEBHE has been around since the mid-50s and has a primary mission to serve the institutions and policymakers of New England, which it does through a variety of collaborative programs ranging from tuition savings program to support for interstate delivery of distance learning, our publication, the New England Journal of Higher Education. But our fundamental concern truly is the sort of the health and welfare of the New England post-secondary sector. It rolls over 1 million students annually, over 256,000 faculty and staff, It pays over nearly $13 billion a year in salaries and a total economic impact of $23 billion a year. And so to say that it is important to New England's economy is an understatement. It really is one of its primary sectors. And of course, our work and interest is to see the continued success of our institutions and everyone who helps support their critical work and endeavors. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Great, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rick Beyer. I'm the Senior Fellow and a Practice Area Leader for mergers, affiliations, strategic partnerships for AGB Consulting. My background is a combination of business and higher education. I spent 20 years as a senior executive and predominantly in technology as a two-time CEO with successful exits, and was also part of the senior executive team at the startup of Qualcomm many years ago. I've been a college president. I've been a board chair of my alma mater, Olivet College. I've served on the American University board, the AGB board, and retired off the AGB board about 5 years ago to help launch with Ken and the group at AGB Strategies, which is now part of AGB Consulting. But particularly, we focused in on two areas, two practice areas: revenue growth and diversification, which is so critical for the future model of higher education, and mergers and affiliations, just simply because of the consolidation era. So I've done more than, gosh, probably close to 30 transactions now, a combination of both business and higher education. And what I try to do is bring a balanced approach, a complete right respecting of what happens and how we operate in higher education, but also understanding from a business perspective, particularly on the financial side, how the operating models and financial models work. So I'm glad to be with you. Thank you so much for a great crowd. So Michael, let me turn it back over to you. I know you have you want to get going at some opening comments.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rick. And I will just say a few words to get us moving here to maybe set a little bit more of the context in New England. You know, we obviously sort of come at this conversation from the standpoint of sort of recent experience in the region, which involved certainly the foreseen as well as the unforeseen. And certainly as we think about the former, you know, as predicted, we've seen sort of competition for traditional aid students that's resulted in downward pressure on enrollments and upward pressure on tuition discounting. We've seen sort of continued downward pressure on public support for post-secondary education, both in terms of state appropriations and aid to students. We've seen sort of the anticipated challenges that many institutional leaders have faced in catalyzing trustees and institutional stakeholders to sort of proactively deal with some of the challenges posed by these factors, forces, and trends, and to really contemplate the need for proactive changes to the institutional model. We've seen an increasing number of sort of institutional transitions. We've had 12 independent nonprofit institutions that have announced closure or have closed. We've seen 11 institutions sort of absorbed or sort of status changed through merger or consolidation or acquisition. And obviously, the unforeseen has been pretty high impact as well. Certainly the shock of a global pandemic that has rippled through certainly the nation, but particularly the region. As we look at recent data from the National Student Clearinghouse, we see a range of enrollment declines ranging from probably about 10% at community colleges to somewhere between 1% and 2% for private nonprofit institutions. And based on NEBHE's sort of projection, we see lost tuition and fee revenue as a consequence of the pandemic at around the better part of $500 million across the region. Now, in terms of one of the other unforeseen things, because I think this revealed what many leaders knew, but you know, was really brought into high relief by the circumstances of the pandemic, was really the hard work of leaders and stakeholders and community members to respond to the reality of the pandemic. I refer to it as our digital Dunkirk, in which really all hands on deck response from institutional leaders and staff and faculty and even students themselves in recent months to make the transitions and the changes that have allowed the vast majority of our institutions to continue on, and I think quite successfully over the last weeks and months, to keep their enterprises moving, and most importantly, to meet the needs of students and keep them learning as they absolutely need to be, despite the challenges of the pandemic. Let me just say one other thing, which is over the arc of sort of the decade of my involvement as president of the New England Board of Higher Education, NEBHE has done sort of on a regular basis every probably year or 18 months, a series of activities that have been focused on these questions of institutional sustainability. And a couple of those critical points for 2013, when we talked about at a 2-day summit of presidents and trustees and board chairs, a summit on cost and financial sustainability that really brought this combination of sort of key stakeholders, trustees and senior leaders and other community members together to talk about these things. And also a recent conversation which parallels our conversation today about models for strategic alliances in higher education. And I think our strategy has been to really try and broaden the framework and to share some design principles for thinking about the opportunities and the alternatives available for alliances and affiliations and partnerships. And we found in our conversations that presidents and institutional leaders have been really eager to have these conversations. They've been welcoming of the notion of sort of outside groups, bringing them together, giving them opportunities to bring together key stakeholders, including trustees, to have these conversations. And in the process of this thinking, I can just share with you this next slide, Chris, which we sort of posed this series of what we would call design principles for strategic alliances to sort of put out there some aspirational statements about what we think the thinking around affiliations and alliances need to be to make these things work and to really make sure that they have the impact that is needed to sort of notably alter business models and have an impact not only on institutional performance, but certainly financial sustainability. The last slide that I'd share here is just briefly sort of this notion of sort of getting in the right zone for making this work successful at the institution. And you can sort of think of where your institution might be on this continuum. Obviously, there are institutions sort of in this status quo zone, or the too soft zone, where they feel like obviously things are changing, but their institution might be exceptional. They don't feel that they need to make the critical changes right now, that it's primarily sort of a problem of external factors or sort of certain things that they lack but aren't necessarily in their control. And then obviously at the bottom end, you see institutions who are already sort of in the crisis zone, where they're coming at these things because they've really been pushed to the brink already. Something has sort of triggered this necessity. But as a consequence of sort of their timing and positioning, sort of the range of their alternatives and their options is fairly constrained. So obviously, we want to talk about how we can get institutions sort of in what we call the Goldilocks zone, where you're aware and motivated. You don't know all the answers, but you're inclined to be able to start asking the right questions. You've got some sort of resources and time that give you the ability to go about this in an organized fashion and to create sort of the right partnerships and engagements that are needed, but also enough impetus to say the time is now and we need to move while we still have some control sort of over our destiny and opportunities and possibilities. So in any case, we think these are great opportunities, particularly in light of the pandemic, for us to step back and sort of again be reflective about the need for these critical questions, to capitalize on some of the experiences and changes and sort of awakening of sort of institutional partnership and stakeholder engagement that have occurred as a consequence of the pandemic, and to bring some sort of resources and partnerships and some structured conversation to the table as a means for helping New England and other institutions engage around these questions. And with that, I would just, Rick, really pleased again to be part of this conversation with you. And as we sort of enter into this conversation, I would just, ask you from your standpoint, as we consider sort of the range of alternatives for partnerships and affiliations, what are the primary trends and forces and sort of shifts that you see that create opportunity and can help to influence how institutions respond?
Thank you, Michael. I think this is a great slide. When I first chatted with you, a couple of months ago, when you're talking about how do you move a mind shift from survival to prosperity. When I think about survival, I think about more incremental change. And we all like incremental change. We'll take any incremental anytime we get that. But when we start to think about prosperity, particularly in this type of environment that we're in, and I'm talking even pre-COVID, in order to think about prosperity, we have to think more transformational. So it's going to be much, much harder. And so what you see here, and it's a busy slide, but I wanted to try to set some context on some of the systemic issues that are going to require transformational solutions. The fundamental business model, and I do a lot of financial modeling with institutions, but when you just take a look at Moody's, Moody's credit rating has downgraded the industry for 3 consecutive years at negative. So we have a negative credit rating on the whole industry, and it's not moving. We've had 9 consecutive years of enrollment decline on a national basis. I know, of course, New England's been hit, but from high schoolers. But when you think about just overall on a demographic shift, you've got also alternative pathways to learning. That's also impacting that decline. And our industry has poor quality of earnings. I mean, it absolutely has poor quality of earnings. And when we start talking about the prosperity gap, we'll give you some examples of that you'll be able to see. So you have all of these issues from economies of scale that are going to become important to technology requirements that are only going to get higher and higher. When you look at the financials, this is pre-COVID. There were 1,200 institutions that were approaching non-financially viable. And it doesn't really matter what metric you use. It really doesn't. That's just a barometer. But as you start digging and peeling the onion back on the financial model of how an institution creates their revenues from operations, it's pretty challenging. So you've got a lot of these things going on all at the same time. So when you start going to the next page and think about how do we think differently about the future, one of the things I talk to a lot of institutions about is thinking differently. We have to think about, quit thinking about how do we improve on things and think much more about what do we do differently, because we have a lot of self-imposed constraints. Our challenges in higher education are no different than what the challenges were in the automotive industry, in the steel industry, in the publishing industry, and on and on and on. Only we have to do it in a governance. We have to do it with either an elected officials or volunteers. So we have just as many major issues. So what happens is that we have a lot of built-in paradigms that limited our thinking. We've tried it, or we tried it and it failed. And I said, well, it might have been a good idea, but maybe you just had the wrong people executing. You didn't invest enough into it. There's a lot of old paradigms, a lot of old policies, just old policies that no longer align to the market. So when we think about these answers, and if I go to the next page about thinking differently, if you have a high financial challenge, so this is this 2x2 on the horizontal axis on financial challenges. If you have a high financial challenge, what we've seen with low creativity is that bottom right, low creativity, and we all get it. We understand why institutions may have to do it, but these are not pathways to prosperity. I mean, 403B cuts, continuing to discount, small incremental moves, on and on and on. Headcount reductions, death by 1,000 cuts. It's just what we maybe, unfortunately, we all do. But that's not the path. That path, if you have a high financial challenge, is up into the upper right. And it is a combination of many things, but it is going to be the level of creativity and innovation and then leadership that you can approach your problems in a different way. Now, if you had a decent financial balance sheet, the model's still busted no matter what. If you had a multi-billion dollars, you're dealing with a busted model through your endowment. But if you don't have that capability, and you're over and to the right, the upper left right, boy, you have the opportunity to create an incredible, strong competitive position. And I think that's what we see with some of the majors. We see a lot of the big are going to get bigger. They're becoming more sophisticated in all areas of their operation. They're taking that upper left, and they're just happen to be in the upper right, and they're going to get bigger and better. So when we think about a model on the next slide, we think about many institutions. Let me just take traditional liberal arts, 4-year liberal arts for a second, private liberal arts. a good thing to do is to take a look at where it is your revenue come from. And, oftentimes we'll see a lot of smaller liberal arts colleges, have 80% or more of their revenue coming from residential undergraduate programs, very traditional. And so what happens is that when you really strip out and look at the financials of how it performs, it performs actually very poorly. Now that doesn't mean that you shouldn't abandon that. Of course, that's sometimes the heart of your mission. But what it does tell you that just incrementally improving on a bad operating model is not going to get you to where you need. It is literally going to be, how do you develop a more comprehensive portfolio of major revenue segments? So on the left side, more digitally; on the right side, perhaps residential, or maybe in person, or maybe blended hybrid. But the revenue diversification has to be significant enough that you have a combination of what I'm going to call low cost delivery programs and high cost. Definitely the undergraduate residential will be the highest cost delivery. And that's okay, as long as it's balanced out by some lower cost major revenue segments. So this is how, one of the things when I talk with institutions about how to transform their model, you just start with revenue segmentation. And so finally on this slide, and then Michael will do a little talking back and forth, is that we have a lot of challenges, and but there are incredible opportunities. I'm bullish on small colleges. They should be able to react faster. They should be able to. If they do or not, it's another thing. But there are great opportunities out there, but it will require a significantly different thinking. The institutional will and resolve probably oftentimes in shorter supply than financial resources. So on and on. And so Michael, let's talk on any of this. And I know you have some insights as well.
Well, I'd be interested, Rick, in your thoughts around this. Sometimes I wonder sort of what the range of knowledge is within the institution about the model, the business model, the revenue models. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you go about building that understanding, because I think to have key stakeholders and community members understand really the basis of how the institution functions and how there's diversity of revenue, and giving them sort of a basic understanding of the business model can be a helpful, important thing to then help them get to the next step, which is, we've got to think about this more creatively. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. How do you create that knowledge? How do you use it to create the conversation?
Yeah, let's just start with that. That's the range of knowledge in terms of starting with the board, which one of the things that we're trying to do more and more of is communicate with board members that you actually have to, when you talk about changing and doing something differently, not better, is just throw away, however, probably 95% of the boards could throw away how they structure their board meetings and focus on much more strategically, and a lot of plenary sessions on what's happening in the markets, because as a board, you have to act as a collective body. Very, very typical for institutions to have, a half a dozen board members who are out in front of the whole board. Particularly now I'm talking about bigger boards, maybe not publics, but setting time aside for plenary. And the same thing internally with the senior cabinet and key constituents in the institution is setting time for plenary, lots and lots of plenaries on a particular topic that you can go deep on. Changing these committee structures that are just do the same old thing today than we've been doing 20 years ago. Get them become more knowledgeable of what's going on, into the market. And then in terms of range of knowledge, in terms of how the business model works, I think it actually kind of dovetails into question 2 if you want to go there, because it'll start to talk a little bit about, or if you want to have some other questions, Michael, depending on how you want to proceed.
Yeah, well, let me ask one more question here, Rick, just for your thoughts. So you talked a little bit, and then we can turn it to Ken, who I know has some other questions here. You talk about this notion of maybe rethinking board committee structures, and maybe give us some additional thoughts. What are some good approaches you've seen on that? How can a president and his or her senior staff use maybe some creative configurations of board and board engagement to sort of advance these topics?
I think boards need to set aside, as brilliant as they all are, is they can't manage. And boards have to get out of the management business. Even though we're in a time when there's just this overly need to be able to manage, that doesn't mean that the board responsibility is any more or less critical. It's probably even more critical today. But take a look at an enrollment committee. You know, everything's reports. Let's take a look at applications. Let's take a look at acceptances. Look at matriculations. You can take a committee today and find 20 years ago they were doing exactly the same thing. So just take an enrollment management committee. Focus on what are the things that we need to be doing differently. Okay, let's take a look at speed and service and talk about and become educated on what is speed and service. How does speed and service and statistics impact our revenue growth? Okay, and I'm getting a little bit specific here, but I'm taking like an enrollment committee because it's so critical. Revenue is critical, and it gives the administration the opportunity to say, well, let's think more about speed and service. Let's think more about what can we do differently to drive, or student life. Again, many of the same olds. Having the executives, the senior cabinet members, be driving the agendas for that, but making them very strategic. Talking about, well, what's happening in adaptive learning, what is happening in coaching and mentoring, what's happening out in the market, and how does that compare? How do we compare to what's needed out in the marketplace? But a lot more higher level strategic. So then the board can say, well, what can we do to help? Okay, or when there's an initiative that becomes strategic, the board has context. And so it's just trying to think differently on these board committees.
Great thoughts. I think, Ken, we've got another question. Did you want to share that?
I do have a couple. Thank you, Michael. And Rick, good to see you. The first question which we have here is, where should institutions start and what should we be thinking about as we go long term with these strategic option ideas? Rick, I think you're going to get into that. And so I don't know if you want to answer that or just we'll flow into that. I think that's a good segue.
Is there another one that we could change a little bit more to number one? But we're going to get into both the business model and this how to transition. Did you have another one, Ken, as well?
Yeah, we do have another one that came through the audience, and they're looking for just a quick explanation of the difference between two terms that we do banter about quite a bit: the difference between digital and online.
Right. Well, in one regards, we're doing digital, right? I mean, we're Zooming, we're synchronous. A digital could be using other forms. It could be using video. It could be using artificial intelligence. It could be using holograms. It could be using augmented virtual reality. There's a lot of different technology. So think more about technology. Online is just nothing more than it's just a method. It's no longer when people say, oh, we're going to go online. That's for me like, oh, what does that mean? That means like, well, we're going to be teaching in person. Like, yeah, good for you, right? You should be doing those both. So you have to go, what I'm trying to do is have them think more creatively and more in a macro perspective, that technology and delivering learning via technology is going up and up and up. Okay, so what we think about online is still going to be there, but when you think about even online, when I'm going to talk about asynchronous faculty mentored, how do we move faculty up the value chain, okay, from teaching to mentoring? Okay, you can still get across the learning outcomes that you can learn by totally, and now we're talking particularly on online design, but we can totally get those learning outcomes delivered. But then you can get yourself in a position where you position your faculty, well, they're not teachers, where they're really huge subject matter experts and they're really mentors. And so it's just a different way of thinking about it and thinking about what other elements of online adaptive learning or technology adaptive learning is another one. And so it's just thinking more broadly, Ken.
Thank you, Rick. I think the next question, and this is tempting, I don't know whether you want to go for it, but the ask is, are you willing to share any perhaps innovators that are leading the way that you've seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, look, it just really depends on what category you want to go into, right? You could look at the big. Everybody knows the big mega, right? Southern New Hampshire's or Arizona State; those are kind of easy to look at. Maybe pick a one that's maybe a four-year institution. We got some community colleges, but Concordia St. Paul in Minnesota. Okay, liberal arts, very traditional liberal arts college, they have about 5 major revenue segments today. They have their traditional undergraduate revenue, maybe 1,500 kids. Okay, but now they've got graduate program that's just as large. They now have their online, totally different, hybrid, and they've launched into boot camps probably 3+ years ago. And that is producing major revenue, and they're integrating that back into and they're getting more into workforce development. And what happens is that when you get that kind of diversification, I don't know what the revenue is, but I know that each one of those segments were probably close to 1,400 each. So that's major revenue. And when you start getting that kind of diversification, the model shifts, because not all of those have the same cost structure. When you get into technology, well, some people say online is more expensive. It totally depends on how you operate it. If you operate in a very traditional manner, it's going to be just like your residential, be very expensive. There's different ways you can offer and blend things together. So that's, but also one of the things I'm also see is that oftentimes the areas where institutions know they need to go, they have no experience whatsoever. And I say that's fine. That's all right. It doesn't mean you shouldn't move forward. It just means you've got to figure out how to acquire those competencies, right? Because the market's going that way. You can say, well, no, we don't do that. Well, okay, then you miss that market. Or look, we really like to get into it, but an OPM agreement is just too expensive, right? And they do well in there's many markets why an OPM would be good, but they are very expensive. And so they go, we don't want an OPM, we don't have it, we can't do it ourselves, so therefore we won't do it. And so you're stopping, you're really letting yourself off the hook. There's so many different ways you can implement and be creative.
Thank you, Rick. I think that was a great answer. There's a lot to talk about there in its own worthy workshop, but why don't we take an opportunity to continue here, and there are a couple that came in, we'll gather them on the next section.
Okay, great. Do you want to go to question number 2, Mike?
Question number 2 is in front of us right now. Where should institutions start, and what do we need to know about exploring long-term strategic options?
All right, let's start with the economic model. And the reason I like doing that is because it sets context with the board, it sets context with constituents internally, is that the economic models for future prosperity require continuous reinvestment into these areas. New program development. Can you imagine Apple or Qualcomm or any of these tech companies, or we only do new product development every once in a while, or it's a major line item on their income statement. Every institution should have a program development line item, not only to develop new programs, but upgrade the existing ones. So you launched a program 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, might need to be refreshed. And so continuous new program and what I'll call sustaining engineering line items, student success and learning outcomes, critical. Lots of technology, lots and lots more investments in technology, digital marketing, employee training, and paying people market-based compensation to retain employees. So we have hundreds, and it's well over 1,000 institutions who just have very, very poor quality of earnings. And they're going to find it increasingly difficult. So now let's go to the next slide and say, well, what do you mean by that? So I work with a lot of institutions on what I'll call a prosperity gap. In the business world, we would call this equality of earnings. So when I was in the corporate world, I sold the business to Trimble Navigation. We were about $1.2 billion. And we did 1 to 2 acquisitions per quarter. And the company liked doing smaller acquisitions, somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $50 million of revenue. And because it was looking for companies who could really grow. And the first thing we would do, it was go through their income statement, and we would focus on the money they weren't spending. Not necessarily what they were spending, but we were focused on the money they were not spending. Because we also knew when you went to sell a company that you're under spending in your product development, you started cutting your costs, right, to make your financials look better. And you pick that apart. You say, no, I want to find out what you're not spending. So I actually use that same analogy and say, well, let's do that in higher ed. And what I mean by that is that let's go through these operational gaps here. And we know when we look at a balanced budget, and we all get why we have to balance budgets. But we also know, and I know probably 100% of people on the line would say, we balance our budget through continuous underinvestment. Well, we just have what we have. We don't have the resources to do it. And we understand that, but we underinvest because the revenue's not there. We cut our heads. We limit this, we limit that. So what this gap does, it's a quantitative analysis, does not take that long, and it doesn't have to be overly sophisticated. Well, what you start doing is you look at, for example, financial gaps. A college, smaller college might have, $5 million of depreciation annually in their income statement. To say, okay, show me $5 million of investment every year. Are you actually spending $5 million replacing equipment and and fixing your dorms and your buildings? Now we actually probably spent about $2 million. All right, that would be a $3 million gap. You're not spending at the rate you should be. Let's start taking a look at things like salaries. Are you paying competitive wages? Let's take a look at what kind of headcount efficiencies by department you've had over the last 3 to 5 years. What kind of support services for students? Things that you want to do. Coaching, mentoring, academic advising, job placement, tutoring. Yeah, we'd like to do a lot more than that. We want to get our retention. We just don't have the fund. Well, let's put ourselves in this mindset of being the best we could be and say, what would we do? And we start just taking these line by lines, just throw some assumptions in. How much underinvestment are we in technology? And we then start adding this up and the numbers get big. And also that kind of shows you and confirms why we have such a problem on the financial model with higher education. And so I'm seeing, prosperity gaps in the $8 to $12 million a year range. This is only incremental margin. So you kind of have to extrapolate what does that mean in revenue? That might mean a $25 million to $40 million, number. And these are smaller institutions. We did one that's about closer to 20 million. And so it kind of sets context on the journey. So when the board says, or somebody says, well, why do we have to do this? Why do we have to grow? Or why do we need to seek a partner? And it helps set context on whether do you have that 20-mile journey or do you have a 2,000-mile journey? Or you might say, look, we know how to get there, but we just can't get there alone. So this is kind of where you start, on this, on it. And then the next slide, I've only got a few more here. We've got the acceleration of taking place. We're in a consolidation era. This era started pre-COVID. So this is very important. We think, that COVID was the catalyst. It was the catalyst for acceleration. And so closures are going to accelerate. And a couple of things, and I work with both what I'm going to call buy side and sell side. And this is not out of any disrespect whatsoever, but just try to know what side of the transaction you're on. On the sell side, maybe a smaller institution or an institutional having some problems, not problems, just financial issues, and they want a partner. They're looking for somebody to affiliate with or merge with. Or in a buy side, maybe being that stronger, financially sound institution. But what happens is that when you this middle bullet here, is that the buy side institutions just are not interested in absorbing significant operating losses. And they're asking themselves, look, this needs to be accretive to earnings, and the differences between on the sell side, the difference between the merger, affiliation, or closure, I absolutely say will be measured by the proactiveness of the Board of Trustees. I've seen institutions that have closed this year 2 or 3 years ago could have done a transaction. But what happens is that the time that you have to take, you have to realize these issues as a collective body much earlier than it's happening. Too often it's being done so late in the life cycle that institutions just run out of options. So if we kind of go on to the next slide, so mergers are out there. Many of them look like, sometimes I call them real estate transactions. They announce a merger, but the reality is it looks something a little bit different. But mergers on the sell side have not been generally well received as this long-term strategy, okay? I don't see a lot of boards saying, let's go out and merge with somebody and we're gonna be on the lower end of the totem pole. And if you look at the right side of why this chart, of why there's a fear of a loss of identity, a fear of loss of mission, The boards don't want to make that tough decision. Volunteer boards, did not, might have a half dozen great board members and 20 people that will, they all love the institution, but many of them aren't there for that kind of work. And so they just don't want to make that decision. And they fear a complete takeover operations, loss of the president, the board. And guess what? All of these are valid. I mean, these are all valid. I would say with the exception of the Southside board not wanting to make a decision. That I would not say that's valid, because the boards are shucking their institutional responsibility. But there's ways that boards can be so positive and to have such a positive impact on their institution by becoming much more strategic earlier. So what happens on the left side here is that you just run the clock out. You run the clock out because, look at, we don't like the left side, we're not going to lose everything. And not realizing that there's different kinds of transactions that are out there to be done, as opposed to just a hard merger, okay? Sometimes a merger is good, but a lot of times it's not. Everything you can think of, the problems on and on, are probably right. So, but they are an opportunity in the right scenario. So when you look at another macro trend that is forming on the next slide is the trend towards systems, okay? Like in the healthcare market today, where the majority of physicians and the majority of family doctors no longer own their own practice, they have joined a system and they take advantage of economies of scale, and they still have relevance, independence. We're going to see that same thing happen in higher education. There are two systems out there today that have operated for slightly more than 10 years, and both of them have been operating very well. One is National University System out in California, and in Chicago. And when I say operating well, I look at, take TCS for example. How are those institutions doing? I think they have like 6 or so affiliates. How are those affiliates? Are they growing? Are they healthy? And they're all healthy. And they're all growing. They've had a history of growth. And the reason is because they're able to do a lot of sharing. They still have their own independence board. Yeah, there's some of these transactions you have consensus on certain consent rights. But this is what happens in the hospital systems as well. There's consent rights. So these are just what's happening. But for a small, mid-sized institution, this is a much softer landing than going through a hard merger where there are going to be a lot of tough decisions made. So what I'm seeing more now is I'm seeing more boards saying, I don't like the long-term trend here, but tell me more about affiliations. What could we do to get into this? And now I see on the buy side, I see now some stronger institutions looking at TCS and National and saying, we really like that model. We want to replicate it. Okay, anything that's good is going to get replicated, and that's very positive. So I know of a couple, at least 2, maybe even a third, that's going to be coming out over the next probably 18 months to 2 years. Okay, you're going to see more of these systems come together, and I think that's going to be good. It's not going to be for everyone, but you're going to see more and more of this happen, of this trend. And then last couple of slides, just one on the sell, one on the buy side. On the sell side, becoming affiliation ready, these are the 3 things. Get the prosperity gap done. Create a substantial growth plan. Now, sometimes this is counterintuitive. Like, what do you mean? We're in trouble. No, create an absolute creative substantial growth plan. This is all in your mind. You've got to get out, put the financials aside, create a growth plan to exceed your prosperity gap. It's going to require innovation and creativity, and you're going to use that growth plan to help you find a partner. And then we'll work with you on a decision matrix. What are the attributes? Who am I looking for? Because you have a lot of, specifically sometimes board members, I think we should do this, I think you should do that. And many times they're good ideas. But a decision matrix, both on the buy and sell side, is important. It allows on the sell side to say, who would we like to affiliate with? What are the attributes that we're looking for? And on the buy side, the same thing. Wow, what are the things that we need to do? What are some gaps strategically we need to fill? And you start creating your attributes, and you can score an institution so that when a board member says, listen, I got a great idea, I think we should look at this opportunity or this institution, you could then run it through the decision matrix and say, wow, it scored off the charts. Or somebody might say, let's look at this opportunity, and you score it and you say, yeah, I know it sounds intuitively sounds good, but it doesn't score well. It puts a little discipline, a little structure around how to proceed. And then the next slide is on the buy side. The same thing on the buy side on the next slide is still understand where you want to be, quantify the future. You can do that through a prosperity gap. And sometimes in bigger institutions, you need to move more revenue. You might need to move $100, $200 million a year of revenue. So it helps set context. And so, but a build by affiliate model can help you realize to say, look, we need to put another, let's just say $200 million of revenue on the top line. Okay, organically, we're probably not going to be able to do that, or it's just going to take so long that it's not going to meet our needs. So therefore, when we look at the marketplace of where we want to be, we may now want to build that part of it. We may want to buy or affiliate with that. The final word here is we get this question a lot. How do I know if I'm too small to go on the buy side? And my answer is very simple. You need a decent balance sheet. Not overly strong, but you need a decent balance sheet. But you need leadership, balanced leadership and vision. And smaller institutions, you can absolutely be on the buy side. But it takes that leadership and vision and a decent balance sheet. If you're late in life, it's tougher to go on the buy side. And then finally, is just these alternative pathways, is that you just have 3 alternative pathways that you can look at. And the next slide is the default is just kind of staying your course, and that's what we do, right? We get what our growth is. We're focused on our strategic plan, or you can be on the buy side, which is kind of a build by affiliate, or you can be on the sell side. But even if you're on the sell side, having a growth plan is so critical to your value proposition. Or you could also affiliate with another institution or join a private system. So it gives you kind of some indication of pathway. Michael, how about your thoughts? Questions?
Yeah, well, I really like the prosperity gap analysis, Rick, and I think it's such a great framework because, in part, I think it really sort of lays things out very clearly. I sort of alluded to this a little bit in my intro comments where we talked about sort of the resilience of our institutions and our people who have worked so incredibly hard during these few challenging past months. And I think that's, a common sort of fact about our institutions is that we're really used to sort of bootstrapping, right? We're used to doing a lot with very little. But I think, the benefit of this analysis is that it puts this in clear relief of what you need to do to close the gaps that are going to make the difference between survival and, success. And I think as you were talking about that, I just sort of maybe asked for you to sort of think about it. I think, I've seen a number of institutions who had sort of a good sort of self-understanding of the realities and of their business and economic model, and they've, shown a fair amount of innovative capacity, but they really hit that resource challenge, right? They've got a growth plan, but they're just not sure how they're going to finance it. And I think, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But I think the partnership and affiliation model is just a really appealing possibility for sort of synergizing and sort of catalyzing the ability for some joint investment on things. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Great question. So when we come from a scarcity mindset, it really limits our ability of what we think we can get done. Now, there might be some financial challenges. If you put together a growth plan and there isn't an investment plan that accompanies it, there's a zero probability that that growth plan is even going to get probably launched, let alone successful. Now, so you have to understand and quantify that growth, and it needs to be big enough. If you have a prosperity gap of $10 million and you require $30 million of revenue annually over a year, maybe over a 5-7 year period of time, you don't say, well, our growth here, we can put another $2 million and that's our entire growth plan. That's great if you can do it, but it needs to be thought about in a much bigger way. Now, how do you finance it, or how do you get your resources? Very, very common that the areas that you need to go into, you may be very thin or not have any resources, human resources, the talent. That can be solved. That's solved with innovation, creativity. There's talent out there. You can buy that. Now, how do you finance it? This is now, I'm saying if you wanted to do it yourself. Coming from the business world, we raise money all the time for operations. We raise money. That's our primary reason. We don't usually raise money to build a corporate office. in the corporate world, right? We raise money because we want to launch. We're gonna launch a new market. We're growing our revenue. We need growth capital, but it's all about how we're growing. So when you transition that into your growth model, there's tremendous fundraising capabilities around a growth cap. When I was at Wheeling Jesuit as a president there, first thing we did is we put together the growth plan and went funding. So we need a few $1 million of walking around money to get this plan implemented immediately. And voila, we show them our value proposition, where we're going, why we want to strive for greatness. And there are people and organizations who will support you, but you have to have that plan. And then when you say, I don't have the resource, I think one of the things you have to realize is the best thing to realize you don't have it, as opposed to trying to use somebody in-house that you don't have, but we're going to give Joe or Mary a quarter of their job assignment on this. It just doesn't work that way. So a lot of ways to finance it. Bigger institutions have a lot more options on financing, a lot more options. It could be a lot of interesting ways you can use capital in the corporate world for that.
Yeah, and maybe just another quick question for your thoughts too, Rick. I mean, I think a lot of times there tends to be a bit of a geographic bias when you think about affiliations. Do you find that to be true? You sort of know who's in your sort of radius of institutions. But I think sort of the genius of the models that you have talked about, including national and TCS, is that they really aren't geography bound. They're really looking more for sort of alignment on sort of key characteristics than they are sort of geographic proximity between two partners. And
this goes into the paradigm. Great question. Geography, I'm telling you, geography and 80%, 80-20 rule will not matter if the transactions are strategic. Okay, if they're strategic. Typically what happens, we in a paradigm like we're going to cram everything together, so therefore we have to be really close with another. That is, you don't want to do a transaction for cost savings. That's the last reason why you want to do a transaction. You want to do a transaction that you can grow, that's strategic. So the more you become strategic, the less geography is ready. So if you look at, now let's take a look at national. They actually they haven't gone west of the Rockies yet. They're kind of like, hey, we're kind of west of the Rockies, but they're in a number of states. I would call, and there's probably a little bit more similarities of those institutions. They have a lot more similarities to them. In the TCS model, I would call that much more comprehensive. They do not want their affiliates looking like each other. I mean, we got two liberal arts colleges 20 miles away. At the end of the day, you're competitors. You're competing for, you might be competing with the same student. They don't want that. They want institutions with different programming that's complementary to one another. So you got a school of psychology in one area and a law school in a different part of the country. So what they're looking for, their strategy is more comprehensive. So geography is not, and you can put these support services anywhere, but the economies of scale, just thinking about technology for a second, how does one institution spend at the level that they need to spend on the technology that is required these days? All of a sudden, you've got 6 institutions who have that same need, but the IT resources are spent way differently, and you can afford a lot more when you go through that. But that's much more formalized. That's not a consortium of casually run institutions. There's tons of that out there. But put it back. I know we've got one more question, one more session here before we go into part 2, Michael.
No, that's great. And we'll turn it to Kevin. I mean, the last thing I'd mention is that I like the structure of your analysis is that you figure out, where are our gaps, where do we want to go, and how do we think we can get there, and then what are we good at or not good at, what do we have and not have, so you know what you got to go looking for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also you want to look at where the market's going. There's big, I mean, we know there are a lot of negative trends. There are a lot of positive trends, big waves. And when I tell institutions, don't fight these waves. These are undeniable waves. One wave, it's undeniable. All right, we know the wave of demographics, high school kids in the Northeast. Okay, but 75% of all students attend 2 or more colleges prior to graduation of their undergraduate degree. That's just undeniable. That's an undeniable wave. I talk to institutions, so what are you doing about that? Well, we have articulation agreements. I said, yeah, so did you have that same one 20 years ago? What are you doing differently? Thinking about why shouldn't your junior class be as large as your freshman class. And you don't need a single articulation agreement to do that. You don't need a single articulation agreement. You need to go beyond that and understand how when these students are coming in, what they're bringing to the table with regards to credits, what your requirements are. So there's so much great opportunity out there.
Great points. Ken, I'm sure you got a question.
Ken, you there?
I am. Michael, yeah, we have a couple of questions. I'll do my best to consolidate a couple of these, and I also just want to give a heads up for time check. Want to make sure we can do our best to catch up a little bit. But one question that did come across, Rick, was can you speak to the role of partnerships and consortia for cost sharing, pricing power, program diversification, et cetera? For example, institutions that could improve their prospects for viability by consolidating back office operations, payroll, legal, et cetera. You seeing any value there? Insurance, dining, you get the idea, I think.
Yeah, let's just say, yeah, they're all out there in a consortium. My big question for consortiums is, do they have the staying power? Like, for example, if you take like a national or TCS, that's exactly what they're doing. You know, legal, compliance, on and on. The amount of resources their affiliates have is just incredibly at a fraction of what they pay. But the more important thing I would say is you can only do so much, right? We all have so much time in the day. Put your same mind share to revenue growth. Okay, because I've said after you cut your cost, now what do? Oh, we cut some costs, we're sharing some courses, we did. Like, all right, now what? You cut your cost. You still haven't addressed the fundamental issue that of how do you drive your revenue. So I think consortiums are good. I'm not a fan of things that are loose and casual because they can disappear as fast as they come together. But I also see where you can get your cost savings. You get, that's fine. I think we're going to see more of the formality come in because I think that'll probably pass the test of time. Can you add another one?
That's it for right now. I was going to go to the next one, I think, to just finish off on this. Yeah. And it boils down to what are some of the challenges, obstacles, or concerns people should have as they navigate these issues, Rick?
Yep, and I'll go quickly on these slides. Institutional will and resolve. Am I willing? Okay, am I willing to meet the student in the market where they're at today? All right, and to acknowledge all of these things that are on, and again, the more you can get aligned with the student, the more opportunities you're going to have, because it's so interesting at how not aligned many institutions are with the student. They're just aligned towards how they've operated in the past. So it really starts with institutional will and resolve. To acknowledge that credentials and certificates are just as important in the eyes of the student. Doesn't matter if it's the eyes of your faculty, it really doesn't, because it's the student that's driving. In fact, corporations are becoming even more important in impacting and influencing what's happening in higher education. But you do see a divergence of students, both young students and students who don't have a degree, going more towards credentials, workforce development, because they're focused on more applied learning. But certificates could be applied learning, that could be soft skills. There's so many different things. So start, are we willing? The next slide, if you could. So I want to be respectful of time here. The board has to understand their incredible fiduciary responsibility, not as managers, and a heightened responsibility for late in life institutions. I think we're already going to start to see institutions have difficult finding liability insurance, especially now post-COVID. And I think you're going to see your insurance changes, how much availability you're going to get. Even D&O insurance might be more scarce. So these are times where trustees really need to think strategically and kind of belly up to the bar with a different thought process of how they operated in the past is not going to be where they need to be. And if they care, I know they care deeply about the institution. So if they care, they've got to think a lot more strategically and ask more strategic questions. Let the administration handle, the enrollment management and the day-to-day things. And it may, if it's not be going really well, it doesn't mean that the board should be managing it. If you're not, then make a change. But the board needs to think about what role they have, and they've got to play a more important role here. Next question, and this also goes to the board in terms of the timeline, because that we have to go through in any transaction a regulatory process. It's just our industry. That's not good. It's not bad. It's just our industry. So, okay, and so there could be multiple accreditors, state, education board, etc. And so what happens from a board perspective, I'd say that you need to be thinking 2 years ahead, because maybe it takes 6 months, maybe move it fast to a year on regulatory, okay? But what happens is that's not the long pole. The long pole in the tent is figuring out what you want to do. And if you have to partner, figuring out who do you want to partner with, identifying, and then building the relationship that you and your board, your board has to be comfortable with that relationship. And on the buy side, if you're on the sell, that board has to be comfortable. That's where the time takes on the good transactions. The good transactions takes time, actually pre-definitive agreement. Once you get to definitive agreement, okay, now you got the regulatory bodies that you have to respect. But this is why I talk about a 2-year time frame. If you wait to the end, your options are just so limited. And then finally, just on some lessons, I got 2 slides on lessons learned that'll go by really quickly. On mergers, there's just never a merger equal. That late in life mergers just never turn out well for sell sides. And oftentimes they look like real estate transactions. And some of those sell side institutions many of them were overconfident about their future. Oh, we're going to get another donor. We're waiting on next year's class, when they really should be looking at their numbers, understanding their prosperity gap, understanding their ability to operate and execute, and say, look, we need to put it together. We need to keep doing that. Let's keep making incremental improvement. Let's not stop that. But in parallel, we need a parallel effort to really think strategically of how do we put this institution in the best light possible to protect our mission, protect students, our alums, and our employees. So it calls for the trustees to step up their game and become more proactive. And then finally, just other lessons learned. What's interesting is that the buy-side institutions, and this is for smaller institutions who are thinking about the buy-side, there are many buy-side institutions who are still sitting on their hands. Okay, we're going to wait. And I said, well, that's fine. You can wait. But while you're waiting, why don't you develop a plan so that when you're ready to go, you actually know what you're looking for, and you've got some rationale, and you'll have more confidence moving into those. And the same time, and same thing on sell sides. On the boards, it's going to be probably one of the most difficult decisions of their lives to let go of a college, even though it might be in the best interest of the institution, students, employees. And it's not necessarily you don't have to let go. In an affiliation, you don't let go. Yeah, there might be a couple of structural changes from a governance perspective when you compare that to what the alternative might be in terms of closure 3 or 4 years down the road. It's like, wow, it's a great opportunity. So the sell side boards need to understand that if you look at this a little bit earlier, and you got the talent, the board will have the talent to just say, look, while you're working on these nuts and bolts, and let's take all the incremental progress we can get, let's look at strategically what we can do for long term. Ken and Mike?
I think that, Rick, I appreciate you catching up with the clock. And we do have one question, but I think we can handle that towards the end here, because one of the things I wanted to do is take a moment now, if it makes sense, to introduce a gentleman that's been waiting in the wings, and we do appreciate his taking some time to spend some time with us this afternoon. That's Larry Shaw, the president of the New England Commission of Higher Education. And Larry, welcome. We see you there. I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts, any reactions to what you've heard so far.
I've got a bunch. I mean, that was terrific. That was, I think, a really terrific presentation. I will consolidate some of my thoughts here so we don't get too far behind, and maybe some of them can, some of these issues can come up in the second hour. So completely agree that what we're seeing is an acceleration of existing trends. These are not new things. We've seen schools close and merge and affiliate across New England for a very long time, and we will continue to see that, and I think we will see an acceleration. As an accreditor, we are seeing all kinds of conversations, and fortunately being brought into those conversations early. you know, we've been talking, I think, mostly about the private side of higher education, but it's important to also note that we are seeing the same kinds of things happening on the public side. Public universities, colleges don't tend to close, but they do merge. We've just gone through a major restructuring in Maine, looking at a restructuring in Connecticut. So I think important not to forget that side of the equation. I haven't talked a lot about, you know, the governance issues and the legal issues with regard to these mergers, consolidations, acquisitions are incredibly complex, and they've got to, as we talked, they've got to go through all sorts of regulatory processes. NEBHE adopted in March, I think, a pilot program that we've just applied for the first time, that and it wasn't necessarily intended for just simply for mergers and acquisitions, but that's how we've applied it for the first time, which allows these processes to happen, to not demand that the new configuration absolutely meets every one of our accreditation standards at the start, but gives schools the ability to take up to 4 years to come into compliance when we think that they're headed in the right direction. So we've actually, with regard to a recent merger acquisition collaboration, the commission's applied the pilot program for the first time. Leadership makes a huge difference here. And so I think there are leaders that come into their role with this sort of mindset of managing these kinds of things, and there are other leaders that it's a long road for them to get there. So I would encourage boards, as they begin to think about this, to think about leadership in this context. And then 3 final sort of points here. Rick talked about the role of the board and sort of encouraging the board to stay out of the sort of administrative piece, which I would totally agree, having been a president for 15 years. On the other hand, at a time when presidents are turning over at an extraordinary pace, I do think boards need to actually take a different role than they have in the past, and to set some financial guardrails and guidelines and ratios that presidents are required to follow, as opposed to throwing out one president, bringing in another president, hoping he or she can build the revenue. So I do think the role of boards is changing, not just changing in this context of acquisitions, but also just in normal times. Point 2, I was working on a study when I took this job of 125 liberal arts colleges across the country, and looking at their expenditures per student. So again, these are all liberal arts colleges, largely undergraduate institutions that for the most part have not diversified their revenue streams to any significant extent. And if you look at their expenditures per student, they ranged from a little below $25,000 to a little above $125,000 per student. Again, similar missions. And so I think one of the things, and the most interesting schools that I found were schools in the middle, spending $50,000 or $60,000 per student when they did not have the resources of the institutions that they're trying to compete with the schools that were spending $100,000, but they didn't have the resources to compete. So I think there has to be not just a focus on the revenue diversification and revenue increases, but a really hard look at what schools are spending. And this is not about suspending pension contributions and things like that, but a complete restructuring of expenses at institutions. If you looked at the ratios, you'd see, there's some schools that have for every 2 students, they have a staff member. Then there's schools that for every 10 students have a staff member. And I would sort of question, is there what's the ROI on the expenditures of that sort. And then the last point, we talked about some obstacles. Shared governance, it can be an obstacle. And one of the things I would encourage institutions to do before they get themselves deeply into trouble is to develop a real clarity around shared governance. Who's responsible for what? What's the board's role in opening programs, closing programs? What's the faculty role? Because if you get yourself in trouble and you start to make significant decisions without having worked through these issues of shared governance, it will stall you out and could stall you out for years. So I will stop there.
Those are really great points, Larry. And I'd be interested from your perspective. Rick talked about this notion of sort of doing, a merger per quarter. And I've had the opportunity as, either a staff member or as a trustee to sort of have a window on a half dozen or so sort of merger and collaboration activities. And it seems to me like, as with everything in life, you get better at it the more you work at it, the more you try. And so I think a lot of institutions that were sort of stuck at, figuring out where do we start this process. And I'd be curious, given your, your work as a president, and obviously given your current role, what would you say to a president and trustee? How do you get this moving?
So, every one of these is completely different. There's not one, there you can draw lessons, but there's not one that looks like another. We've seen in the last year very significant merger deals completed in months, not years. And it takes presidents and boards on both sides to sort of commit to doing it. But the key is to find the right partner. And if you have the right partner, these things can happen actually quite quickly, as long as just partly why we're using our pilot program here to help accelerate some of these things. I was talking to a president the other day that said, I had a plan A and I had a plan B. And my plan A was to keep my institution going. My plan B was to find a partner. And the board and I spent equal amounts of time on both of those, even though we would have preferred for plan A to happen. Turned out plan B happened, but it happened in a very successful way. But so that there was a commitment not to be sort of stuck on the sort of let's run this thing out, let's see if we can save this place. There was a desire to do that, but there also was a commitment to be creative. So every one of these is different. Leadership, I would say, is the most important thing in having a successful consolidation happen.
Great points.
Well, thank you. Rick, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I thought Larry's comments are right on. Just one comment on, on the board, those financial guardrails are important. That's absolutely, I would call that's a very strategic work of the board to say, look, you got to run the ship, but here's some guardrails here. We can't be going off these guardrails. But I do think, just the work on what Larry talked about, the 125 colleges that you looked at, as you start digging into these numbers and you just start looking at, for example, instruction expense as a percentage of net tuition. Just throw all the everything else out. Just take your instruction expense and take your tuition after discount, okay, and just take that ratio. National average, we're about 66%. It does not leave a lot of margin contribution for the balance of the institution. And so, and yet it'll be all over the place. So I think those are great. And then shared governance, just it's critical, but don't confuse shared governance with shared operating decisions. Sometimes the faculty, you have key constituents participate, absolutely. But, sometimes there has to be accountability. Somebody has to make a decision. And and if you can separate that and just know when shared governance is needed versus collaboration. Collaboration is always needed. So I love the comments, Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, Michael, Rick. What I think I'll do is take this moment to segue into our second hour. We're a little bit into it, but I think the discussion and the content has been superb so far. So if Candace is on, Candace, can we bring your camera up? I wanted to introduce everybody to Candace Williams, who's the Senior Director of Policy and Research at NEBHE. And Candace, I know you're going to orchestrate the panel now, and so we're going to give you the full burden of having to handle all of that from here. How about that?
Sounds good. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to listen to the information and comments shared so far. I will be introducing Dr. Michelle Perkins and Dr. David Rowe and posing a few questions to them before inviting Rick and Larry back into the conversation, as well as the audience. Beginning with Dr. Perkins of New England College. She has served as president of New England College since 2007, and under her leadership, the college has more than quadrupled its enrollment to over 4,000 students in multiple delivery models, including on-campus, on-location, low residency, and online. She's guided a merger with New Hampshire Institute of Art in Manchester, now the Institute of Art and Design at New England College, as well as initiated and led the college's first capital campaign, which raised $42 million, twice its initial goal. Dr. David Rowe is currently the interim president of Lancaster Theological Seminary and past president of Centenary College of Louisiana, and also works with AGB. His presidency at Centenary College is of note as he took office as the 30th president on heels of the Great Recession, and he challenged the college to redefine church-related liberal arts education for the 21st century. And the college responded by globalizing the educational experience of its students, shoring up the institution's finances, integrating curricular and co-curricular offerings to encircle the world with wise, caring, moral leaders. So first, Michelle, I'd love to hear from you, given your experience with the merger with the New Hampshire Institute of Art. How do you create a culture with your board, faculty, and staff that supports a change as transformative as a merger?
Well, I think the New England College Board was always change-oriented. I think the institution had a kernel of entrepreneurship for many years, so there was it was a great foundation to work with. But it took a number of years for the institution and for the board to really understand that it's really second-order change, or even there you can refer to as third-order change. You can't just nip around the edges. That if you want to grow and succeed, and much of what Rick said is just so spot on, you have to make some major decisions. It's not just small increments. And so when an opportunity, you identify the opportunities you want to pursue, and when one presents itself, our board was ready to go forward. It was not a challenge persuading them to do so.
Great. And David, a slightly different experience at Centenary, where you had particular success turning around the institution's finances, growing the college's assets, lowering yearly costs and reliance on the endowment. Do you have proactive steps that you would recommend institution leaders and boards would take so that they don't reach necessarily a turnaround situation?
Well, I think one of the things I'd like to comment on in terms of building board culture and kind of following up on some of the things that Rick and Larry were saying is not only do you have to have the culture of the board, but you really have to have the paper right too. And I would encourage folks before they get into making big decisions to make sure that their bylaws are in good shape, that they're not just a series of renovated amendments over the course of 20 or 30 years, to make sure that you've clarified roles and responsibilities before you get into making major decisions like that. And so I think, the prosperity gap model is a terrific way to begin to anticipate when you might actually be getting into financial trouble. We think of our institutions as resilient. Most of our institutions are, a century or more old, and we think about all the different things that they've been through. But we've been through those things. We've weathered those things in exactly the way Rick said earlier, that we've, deferred maintenance. We've really lowered our investment in terms of our personnel. We're borrowing, maybe not from a bank, we're borrowing against the health and well-being of the institution itself. And so anticipating what kinds of debt, hidden and unhidden, you might have well before it shows that your expenses are exceeding your revenues. Candace, your sound is not on right now.
Thank you. I'm dealing with a hyped up dog in the background, so I've closed the door and hopefully that should handle that. But Michelle, I would also love to hear some of your reactions, initial reactions to Rick and Larry and Michael's presentation as well.
Well, I couldn't agree. I agreed with everything that was said, and it is so absolutely true that you have to be eyes wide open when you lead a small tuition-dependent institution, and look down the road 5 years every day of your life, or 10. And is your institution going to be here 10 years from now? And what are the challenges going to be? So that, again, if you have to completely reposition your institution and make significant change, there really isn't a choice because the alternative is demise. And there will be the COVID, forget who said it, I think maybe it was you, Larry, that there have been closures over a period of time. There will be mergers and consolidations, but COVID has really only accelerated that. That was on a path to happen regardless. And so, and the demographic decline, you look back 17 years, you could see that coming, and most of us were around that long ago. It really is necessary to understand what it'll take. And for us, we realized multiple revenue streams many years ago was the way to go. We have a small endowment, and when we got into the online and graduate space, and the graduate is either online, hybrid, or low residency, that completely changed our world, and that functions at high margin and has made all the difference. And so our vision going forward is how do we scale that even further?
Yeah, exactly.
And that brings to mind Rick's model for investment and prosperity in the long term, that looks at continuous new program development, student success, technology, marketing and student acquisition, employee training, market-based compensation for employee retention. And for New England College, the revenue coming from graduate programming became a significant part of the school's success. But how should institutions think about, if they can't conquer more than one of these areas, think about deciding a new area for investment for long-term prosperity?
You want me to respond to that?
Sure, you could go first, and then David, and of course Rick and Larry, please weigh in.
I think you have to know what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and you have to be able to know what the opportunities are based on either what your institutional focus is or even your location. But you have to be eyes wide open and know thyself, know what you have, what you don't have. Because wishing and hoping and saying next year will be different is sadly what a lot of institutions do. And you really, so in many ways, the first thing to do is a culture change if you're not able to look realistically at who you are and what you need to do.
I'll pick up on that, Candace. You know, one of the things I think that's important to help the campus community understand is even though we think of ourselves, particularly in the smaller institutions, as being in one business, we already are in multiple businesses. You know, most of us are in an asset management business, we're in a fundraising business, we're in a property rental business, in addition to the education business. And so sometimes when you first inject that idea of creating new revenue streams, it seems like anathema to the academic community. And you have to realize that the academic enterprise is already dependent on multiple revenue streams. But what we're seeing is that those revenue streams just aren't robust enough right now to support the resources and the overhead that most of our traditional institutions have. And so I would, you know, kind of start from the core and build out. And the first thing, you know, I would, you know, focus on is kind of what Rick talked about there toward the end of his comments, and that is look at that margin between what the net tuition revenue is giving you and what the expenses you have are of delivering the academic program. You know, over the course of the last couple of decades, I think a lot of small colleges have been convinced that they should focus on net tuition revenue and not net tuition revenue per FTE. I really think that you have to look at that margin on a per student basis until you actually have the ability to scale. You cannot operate at these thin margins where the discount rates really punch up there and give you very, very little wiggle room to work with just in delivering a core enterprise. And then once you get that core enterprise settled, and start going outward, and as Michelle said, know your strengths and know your competencies and what you can monetize relatively quickly. Get profit first before you go to growth.
Candace, I have a sort of thought here. I'd like to sort of push the conversation sort of up a little bit. That I do think, I mean, there are going to be winners and losers in this game. You look at the demographics, everybody can't build revenue. I mean, it's just, it's nice to think everybody can build revenue, but everybody's not going to build revenue. And as Michelle said, I think you start with what do you do well? And where can that take you? But I do think that if you look back a decade or two where you have seen the signs of the collapse of pieces of our enterprise, the responsibility, in my view, sits squarely on the shoulders of the boards, and it will going forward as well. I do think there's an opportunity for presidents to help lead a board. If the board is willing to let presidents do that, and if you have, I mean, I had a 15-year tenure, and Michelle's got a long tenure, and at some point, the board sort of become a president's board, and you can help lead a board. But unless the board, you know, going back to my study, of those 125 schools, a massive number have had structural deficits for 2 decades. And the boards just hope that a new president would fix it, or that the revenue would come back, or I don't know what. But and I think to Rick's point about, you know, the future and this, the opportunities for boards at the right time to take the actions to save their institution. Again, it sits on the board. Again, I think presidents can help lead a board, but these are massive decisions that have to get made, and if the board's not prepared to do it, then it won't get done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Candace, in your question about some of these new areas, when you're thinking about maybe an institution looking, and of course, New England College has done an incredible job of diversification. Really a classic case of well-balanced diversification and just constantly being out there looking at where the market's at. I like Michelle's comment about eyes wide open. When I talk with institutions, I say there's never one single silver bullet. Well, if we could just do one thing, we're going to be, it really won't. But when I think about growth, and Larry's correct, not everybody's going to grow. But the good news is this: there's not going to be an equal level of effort either. Okay, so there's going to be, if effort's this big versus this big, you'll probably have some better chances. But one of the things I talk about is strategic growth building blocks. And the first thing what I look at, and I talk to institutions, is look internally at what they have. There could be some really incredible nuggets of excellence that can be scaled by 10x or 100x. I was working with an institution. It was an online program. It was an incredible program, very specialized program. And it went from, we started at 19 students, and they were very proud. They had it up to 150 students. And the person running it said, that's about it. We feel really comfortable with that. I think just look at the market is, 25 times that, but yet they stopped short because the mindset wasn't about scaling or really understanding how that incremental margin contribution, which was substantially larger, could make an impact on the greater good, of the campus. So that's an example. And then understanding, again, your numbers and getting into, and when Larry's talking about these, the costs and the expenses in a level of detail, you get down, as Dave said, the instruction level. And I say the best way to improve, the number one way to improve your productivity and lower your instruction costs today, you don't have to spend any money. If you spend a little bit of money, you'll be even better off, is addressing the macro trend of transfer students. The market's huge on transfer students, but the way we go about it, that 80% or 90% of our traditional classic institutions is the same way we've kind of gone about it a long time ago. As you pull let's just say you take a student in their junior class, take a new student who's a junior, they're coming into those generally smaller classes, right? Your productivity actually increased. Your cost actually got lower by having better mix and understanding your product mix. And just having that could be a very nice strategic growth building block. So kind of the point is that there's probably 3 or 4 things that you have to do. You may have to get into some new areas because the market's there, but you have to understand, where your strengths are and eyes wide open on all this stuff.
Certainly, and I think one of the thoughts for me that comes to mind on that statement is that institutions can often be defined by a mission that they've held for a very long time. It's what their community buys into, it's what their alumni buys into, it's how they market themselves to students. And the pandemic's impact on enrollment, delivery models, new populations of people who require post-secondary education and that the institution would benefit from bringing in, like transfer students, that all shifts an institution's mission or perhaps those stakeholders' understanding of the institution's mission. So I would love to hear from Michelle, David, Rick, and Larry. How should institution leaders, presidents, and boards be thinking about their mission, and what role does that play?
That's a very good question. I think sometimes people even confuse mission with mission statement, and you can't. Mission is an abstract, and therefore I think for most of us that leaves you a lot of room. Most of our colleges, when we were founded, nobody sat around and said, well, we'll do traditional undergraduate and we're not going to do online, because it didn't exist. Right. It's kind of like looking at the Constitution. It's still valid today, but it has to be interpreted for today's standards. And I think for us, when we got into online, or we got into some of the alternative delivery modes for graduate programs, there was resistance to that because it didn't seem to align with our mission. But actually it did very well. And delivery mode is not necessarily your pedagogical ethos. It's a way to educate. It's a means. And I think institutions have to get their heads around that. There was great fear among our full-time faculty that going online, if we had thousands of students, it would fundamentally change who we are. And it's made us richer. And now people are happy about that. But it hasn't changed who we are as an institution. In fact, I think it's amplified and enhanced all the good things about what we are. But you have to get your community to be able to not be afraid of that kind of change. when you had success and when students started coming to graduation and they were so talented and wonderful, then, you know, that kind of the log jam kind of broke. But your mission is something, again, abstract. And I think oftentimes institutions even confuse real estate with mission. I like to say we're not in the real estate business. We have a lot of it, but that's not what we do. We educate. And I think you have to keep iterating that. You have to keep saying that to your community.
Candace, I think that's the central question that cuts through everything that we've talked about today. And I just want to draw 2 lines underneath Michelle's comment about, you know, don't confuse mission with mission statement. If you look at a school's mission statement, you can often identify exactly who is on the task force that wrote it. And so, you know, who wanted to plant their flag, you know, just make sure that it never went away. That's not why people founded these institutions. Whenever you'll know that you're actually talking about the enduring purpose of the institution, if you're talking about something that's greater than and outside of the walls of the institution. You know, what did the people want to accomplish when they founded that institution? It wasn't to have a corporation to perpetually, you know, employ people and to deliver education in a particular modality. It was really to change the world or to change the community, to lift up the local population. And so you take those kinds of notions and you think about what does that mean in 21st century modalities, and it really transforms the conversation. And it also makes a lot of these conversations easier too. So as Michelle said, you know, maybe you need to dislodge it from the real estate, from a 150-year-old building, from a particular way of teaching and learning. And, you know, as Rick is suggesting and provoking us to think, maybe the mission lives better in partnership with somebody else, or as part of an affiliation, as part of a collaborative. If your fidelity is to the mission as opposed to the institution, the mission can have a much longer life. If your fidelity is to the institution, you might end up compromising and in fact losing your mission.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's the institution I led for 15 years was founded in 1835, and between 1835 and 2020, it was, I don't know, 20 different things, you know. So I think mission is often used by some people as just as a way to thwart the change that's in front of them. But if you went back 15, 20 years at almost any institution, their mission looked somewhat different than it does today.
Exactly. I would agree 100% with that, Larry. I think that and mission is critical. It absolutely is critical. But I think that, you know, when I worked with Father Jim Fleming and the Jesuits, you know, even the Jesuits said, if you have no margin, no mission. So you still have to have an economic model, an economic engine that produces something to be able to sustain and strengthen your mission. And when we think about being student-centric, and okay, if we're student-centric, is that good or bad for our mission? I don't know, a lot of different missions, but I would say generally speaking, we're probably okay. If we're really doing well, we're student-centric, it's probably, we'll find ways to align the mission. But like Michelle had said, things change over time. Student needs and demands in the market has changed over time. And we have to do that. We'll give a plug for our industry when we talk about, you know, we're slow to change, right? We can't do this, we can't do that. But there's that old saying of the necessity is the mother of invention. It creates that sense of urgency. Look at what we did with COVID on institutions turning on a dime. Now, one could talk about what kind of quality one had versus another, but look at everybody turned. We responded as an industry because there was urgency. I mean, it was this, we needed to, and there was urgency, and we all pivoted. And again, we could talk about if it's how effective we were here, but it really changed our mindset. And I think it's that kind of the necessity of that invention that we have to apply to our general strategy moving forward. It's okay to align with the student. It's okay to align the student. And you'll find this, you know, the mission, as you said, it's really much more macro. If you keep it macro and don't make it specific so that you're naming market segments because you have your mission, you change your mission so specific. It would keep it broad so that you can do good.
Doing good. I think that's exactly where we all strive to be. I want to ensure that the audience has an opportunity to ask you all their questions, but before handing it back to Ken to help moderate that aspect of the panel, I think it would be helpful if each of you could share perhaps one lesson and the context around that lesson that you would leave the audience with related to strategic partnerships and affiliations and whatnot. Michelle, would you mind kicking it off? You have one ready?
Well, since we completed a merger, and you certainly, you know, we completed ours in a year, by the way, and it seemed like 5 years. and then people said, oh, you did that quickly. It certainly was due to collaboration, cooperation on both sides, but particularly between the two boards. If that hadn't been there, if there hadn't been the willingness, it wouldn't have happened, that leadership. We did not work with a consultant either, although we hired a professional who was skilled with such projects to be a vice president, and he remains with us because we are pursuing other, if not mergers, affiliations and innovative projects to complement what we've already done. I think that probably the thing I learned mostly from the merger is that, you know, there's the finance piece, there's the operational piece, there's the board piece, there's the accreditation piece, the attorney general piece, but first and foremost, one must be sensitive to culture and understand that, especially if you are on the buy side, that the sell side is very sensitive, and it's important to respect their mission and their ethos and identity, even as they become part of the larger institution. I think if you don't do that, you have a very low probability of success, because the other institution can always choose to back out, can choose closure.
Good point. David.
So I think I would underscore the need to clarify roles and responsibilities up front. And I think whether you're talking about mergers and acquisitions, whether you're talking about a financial turnaround, or just navigating COVID, I think all of our institutions are really entering into some uncharted territories. And as Rick pointed out, you know, we've really kind of been rocking along with the same governance structures for a long time, and those have gotten us to where we are now. And I think we need to be really clear that adaptive governance structures, which in one sense, you really have to clarify, you know, who does what, when, and how. And so one lesson I would say is co-locate authority and responsibility. So to Larry's point about shared governance, you know, in my experience, the board, before we kind of embarked on the financial turnaround, really updated all of their governance documents, made sure that the faculty, the president, and the board were all on the same page about whose decision what was. And trying to get that clarified ahead of time is really important. Now, we still hit bumps in the road where we had different understandings about who does what when, but and you're not going to be able to get that perfect. But if you don't try, you really won't. You might end up having kind of a knotted up mess that is very difficult to move through and doesn't really authorize the board to, you know, do what it needs to do as quickly as it may need to do it.
That's a great consideration. Larry, Rick, any lessons you would like to share from your journeys?
I'll point quickly that's two recent consolidations. You never know what word to use, but one was the Pine Manor Boston College transaction, and the other was just the one that the commission just approved 2 weeks ago, or was the Goodwin University of Bridgeport transaction. And if you look at these, they basically happened in 6 months from start to finish. Looked like different things across the way, but you know, I think both will be successful. And again, I think the credit for that goes to board leadership and presidential leadership,
Right.
able to make those things happen, worked hand in hand with the creditors along the way to help form that, adjust it in a way that would work. And so these things may seem daunting, impossible, but you can pull them off.
Yeah. And probably one of the better lessons that I've had is watching a sell side board go through, which started out as an agonizing decision, to ended up realizing that, and in their words, we're not failing here, where they saw pathway for an affiliation. And initially the president saw it. The president saw it, and even the cabinet saw it. They saw, oh my goodness, there's some really great, on all transactions, you want them to be strategic. Not all of them, of course, are. But what happened is that they went through some process, and good process will lead you to a good result. Good process. They formed a small committee of the board. Very good. Now that board committee's out ahead a little bit. That's okay. They're getting educated. And then they brought things back to the full board and kept educating, and kept moving the boards through what I'm going to call small decisions. So as opposed to taking the board from like step 1 to step 10, and it's like this massive decision, they went through a series of 5 or 6 yesable transactions. So by the time they got to the end, they were feeling more comfortable about it, and they realized that if we stay alone, we're definitely not going to make it. But we're not in danger today of going out of business, but we could be if things don't turn around right away. And COVID was tough, but you saw a sell side board really realize that this transaction was in the best interest of the institution, the employees, and the students. And they realized that the board had to realize that they had to put their own personal preferences aside. What is the responsibility of that institution and affiliate? And they're still going to be there because it was an affiliation, but that's positive. I see that as real good, positive way to have good process.
Well, thank you all for sharing those thoughts. I want to turn it back to Ken to see if there are any questions from the audience for you all.
Thank you, Candace. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. And Rick, this might go towards you, but I'll ask anybody else that wants to add anything to it. We have a question from the audience. If an institution wants to be a buyer, particularly for an institution that is not necessarily close geographically, how does the buying institution identify those potentially complementary affiliations?
Well, the first thing you'd want to do is first of all, understand your journey of that old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So kind of back up and try to understand your context. Is it because you need to add another 50 million of revenue, or you're trying to go into these new areas because you don't have those competencies and you want to buy yourself into those competencies? But the decision matrix, I talked about the decision matrix on the buy side, creating a list of attributes, positive attributes of what we're looking for. And you know why, these are, and you probably throw some negative attributes. Listen, we want to stay away from this, this, and this. Now you can score a transaction. It's not due diligence, but you can score a transaction. And then all of a sudden, what you then do, and of course, this is the work that I do on the M&A side, is that like people will call me up and say, Rick, can you identify? I said, yeah, all day long. I said, but you have to know where you want to go and why you want to be there. So just the decision matrix alone will then help open up the market. And that's what AGB helps. So like I will help identify those candidates for the buy side, and then I'll say, these line up to your decision process, your decision matrix. So you don't be looking at you don't want to be kind of ad hoc, looking here, or the deal du jour because a board member says, I think we should do this. It might be a good idea, but that decision matrix will allow you process, some discipline, and then those attributes saying, that's what we're looking for. Now you can then start looking now at geography, then it's a lot less important. You'll see that as you get into this, you'll be able to do transactions. Now, what kind of transaction, if you're talking, no, we're going to merge the operations or anything, you still could do it, but there's different ways you can do things and structure. So the wider your net gets, the more opportunities you're going to have. But most importantly, is narrow down that decision matrix to give you a little structure so that you can look at the right kinds of deals.
Michelle or anybody else have any thoughts to that? We have the next question, and this is for the group. It focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Pointing out the issues are how do these issues impact your thinking? Looking at the increased number of low-income first-gen students who have increased difficulty returning to college, and yet they are growing demographic. Most of the examples you've discussed in the second hour have involved private institutions merging with other privates. How are mergers between public institutions different, or processes they follow in merging different?
Well, I'll take a stab on the publics. While Larry made a really good point that they may not close, they'll probably consolidate or restructure. We have gotten involved now multiple times where a public institution's talking with a private institution. Now there's some limitations sometimes of what can be done and how deals can be structured because there's debt and there's lots of different covenants. But this is where an affiliation, formal affiliations, can be done. So so we worked on a 4-year college and a 2-year public community college, and there was definitely strategic alignment. We redid the entire financial model, but yet the institutions had to remain separate, and they couldn't commingle the assets because we were dealing with a public institution. So there are private transactions out there for a public. They just need to be structured a little bit differently. It'll probably look a little bit more like a formal affiliation, but a number of different ways you could do that.
One of the things you saw in Maine, so Maine had, I think, 7 universities across the state. A number of them tiny, small, in rural areas, underfunded. And so I think the rationale behind the consolidation into one institution from these 7 was to enable the deep collaboration, sharing of programs, so that those smaller institutions that by and large are serving poor first-gen students could have a richer array of programs because they were being supported and funded out of the system. So I think we're seeing that the 12 community colleges in Connecticut are looking to become a single one. I think for the same purpose. That process is not moved as fast as they'd like, but it's I think what you're seeing is that the flagships generally are doing okay, are healthy, but it's the smaller regional ones that are suffering, and it's those that probably serve a greater percentage of first-gen students.
So I'm a first-generation college graduate, and I have a big heart for that segment. And a lot of private institutions, particularly, have really seen an increase in the number of Pell-eligible students and first-generation college students coming across their thresholds. And so I'll take a stab at the DEI question. I think the more socioeconomically diverse that we see our student bodies, the more important it is to remember Rick's maxim of no margin, no mission, and make sure that we actually are finding diverse revenue streams to be able to fund the financial aid that might be necessary to diversify our student bodies in that way. And diversity along other lines, I think, takes really systemic commitments in the institution, and make sure that you're thinking about hiring, you're thinking about your admission policies and procedures, and you're reducing barriers at every place that you can. And when you reduce those barriers between the student and accessing the educational experience, not only do you increase the chance of being able to diversify the student body and the faculty and the staff, I think you also increase the opportunity to do transactions with folks who are really interested in the educational experience you offer. Rick has mentioned a number of times transfer experiences for juniors and coming into college. We particularly in the traditional liberal arts college world have set up processes and curriculum that have a holistic understanding, and it's very difficult for us to understand how someone can intercept that in the middle of the flow. And we really have to re-examine our processes and the things that we really, in some cases, hold sacred, and find out how those things are inhibiting both the financial stability and sustainability of the institution, but also the ability to diversify and make the education accessible.
If I could just add one little thing, I think that frankly, well, for us, having multiple revenue streams has allowed us to fund more generously first-gen students. We have quite a few. Yeah. In fact, we are the most diverse, racially and ethnically diverse college in New Hampshire at 36%. And New Hampshire itself, the population is about 6 or 7. We intend to stay that way. So as we scale our other programs in graduate and online study, it allows us the money to be able to continue to discount at a high level, or even reset our price. We've been talking about that, so that we can continue to serve this population, because affordability is key. And also pragmatically, if we aren't marketing and attracting the population, we're not paying attention to demographics, which is look ahead 10 years and behave like it's now is what we try to do.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think that was good. We may have 1 or 2 more questions, but I want to respect everybody's time here. And I want to talk about something that's very important. So hopefully those that are listening, listen well, because we're not finished. I'd like to extend an invitation to everybody that has attended, that we will do some follow-up sessions. We call them Ask the Expert sessions, where we have more intimate conversations. This is not a one-to-many kind of presentation. This is an opportunity to come collaborate, have a conversation with as many as 20 of your colleagues from other institutions. We do these on a regular basis, but we're going to aim several of these as follow-up to the session today. So we'll be sending out some information as to how and when you could sign up for any of these sessions that we'll be putting out there. You could sign up for multiple instances, that's fine. So please keep an eye out for those messages coming your way to talk about follow-up Ask the Expert sessions. I think it's a great way to continue to talk about it and listen from your perspective and get into the conversation. If you have anything you'd like to ask any of us before then, we're showing right now our contact information. And by the way, we'll provide these slides available. These will be made available to everybody that participated today. But don't hesitate that any one of us are happy to take your incoming. The email addresses are provided there for the people like David and Rick. And also, as you look at the slide deck, I just wanted to share with you that there are many events that we have upcoming at AGB, and we'll be doing some of these, we hope, again, with Larry and his group and with Michael and his team. But do keep an eye out on our upcoming AGB events calendar. There are many sessions that I think are going to be very pertinent to what we were talking about today. And then lastly, don't hesitate going to our website, in particular AGB. We have a dramatic amount, a significant amount of information available to you that you can easily find from the overall AGB member experience. We provide content, certainly the expertise that you heard today, but there's a host of a realm of information that you can get access to. And it ties in well with our partners as well. So don't hesitate going out and doing a little more investigation on your part, and come back and meet with us again in the upcoming Ask the Expert sessions. With that, I think we're just at the top of the hour. I wanted to thank everybody in the panel, Larry, Rick, David, Michelle, Michael, Candace. I think today went extremely well. I think we covered a lot of ground. Wish we could take another hour, but I think we probably zoomed people out. So I'll let everybody go at this time. Again, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, Michelle, Michael, David. Great to be with you guys.